So in the last lecture, we were discussing standards that are used when making decisions for incompetent patients. The first approach whenever making such a decision is we appeal to evidence of the person's wishes, what they would have wanted. And this is in general known as the autonomy-based standards. And the basic idea behind this, the philosophical justification for doing so, is that we're trying to respect their wishes, what they would have wanted. When a person is competent, they can, at that point, refuse or accept various treatments. But once they've been deemed incompetent, what we want to do is try to best respect that in any way possible. And then the question becomes one of evidence. Well, how do we know what the person would want? Even though they're no longer here to speak for themselves, how do we know? And we have three types of evidence that are appealed to. We have what is known as an advance directive, which is just a written document of some sort. Then we also, and this would specify what they want. In the absence of any advance directive, then we appeal to oral directives, which are basically statements that the person has made while they were competent as to what they would want. And then finally we have substituted judgment, which is where someone who has an intimate knowledge of the person tries to reconstruct what that person would want based on their understanding of them. However, there are problems with the autonomy-based standard, which is that in many cases someone left no evidence whatsoever of what they would want. And in other cases, the person was never competent to begin with. When that occurs, what is appealed to is what is called the present best interest test, which is where we simply say, okay, what would be good for the person now? And here we have a pure present best interest test where we just say what would be good for them now based on what the average person of reasonable intelligence would want. We also have what is called a limited best interest test, where we try to say what is good. We ask the question, what is good for them now, and maybe we can supplement that with some of what we think they might have wanted. Now this all seems well and good, and it seems like the autonomy-based standard makes a lot of sense in cases where we do have reasonable evidence. But in this lecture, we're going to look at some problems with the autonomy-based standard. And perhaps the single biggest problem with the autonomy-based standard is the problem of ambiguity. And the fact of the matter is that both substituted judgment and living wills and oral directives, for that matter, all require interpretation. They require interpretation in the language the persons use. They require interpretation in the attitudes that a person may have demonstrated. For instance, when we look at substituted judgment, what does a person's negative attitudes really demonstrate about what they would want now? In one of the cases I mentioned, there was a woman who she had demonstrated negative attitudes her whole life about going to the doctor, and that was used as evidence that she would not want to have a feeding tube in her now. But is that really evidence of that? I myself, I rarely go to the doctor, but I rarely go because the conditions I have are typically pretty mild, and I don't want to pay the expense of going to the doctor. I don't want to go to the doctor just to get told to put ice on an injury and use ibuprofen and then have to pay $100 for that. So I can figure that out myself, so I don't go to the doctor. Even when I'm pretty sick, my typical default is just to wait it out unless things get really bad. So if that were the case, and let's say I got in a severe car accident tomorrow, someone might say, well, look, Jesse always avoided going to the doctor, so he wouldn't want to be hooked to a respirator at this point in his life. He'd rather just die. But that's not true at all. The only reason, like I said, I don't go to the doctor is because most of my conditions that I've had have been pretty mild, and I wouldn't want to have paid the expense. But if it was a life or death situation, yeah, I definitely would want to be kept alive as long as there was a reasonable shot of some recovery later on. So my point here is just looking at a person's negative attitudes don't necessarily tell you the whole story, and those require interpretation. And when it comes to interpreting, a lot of times interpretation is left to family members, and these can reflect covert family preferences. For instance, suppose that a person has left in their living will that they don't want to be hooked to any kind of artificial assistance. Well, suppose that their family wants the mother or the father or whomever to go ahead and pass away so that they can inherit money. In that case, then what constitutes artificial assistance might be given a very, very wide interpretation. They might say, well, look, mom said no artificial assistance, so she wouldn't want to have a feeding tube or she wouldn't want to be intubated for 24 hours. She'd rather just die. And this is something that you have to be very wary of because exactly interpreting a person's language, interpreting a person's attitudes can be a really, really tricky thing. And I want to give you guys an illustration of just what I'm referring to here and share with you a living will. Because living wills are typically considered to be the gold standard of evidence for precedent autonomy. So just read along with me in this. This was a living will that was left by a woman who is suffering. So here's what she says. To my family, my physician, my lawyer, and to any medical facility in whose care I happen to be, or to any individual who may become responsible for my health and welfare or affairs, death is as much a reality as birth, maturity, and old age. It is the one certainty in life. If the time comes when I can no longer take part in the decision for my future, let this statement stand as an expression of my wishes while I am of sound mind. Now we'll just stop right there for a minute. None of that tells you anything as to what you should do. This is just her leading up to her living will. So here's the real core of it. If a situation should arise in which there is no reasonable expectation of my recovery from physical or mental disability, I request that I be allowed to die and not be kept alive by artificial means or heroic measures. I therefore ask that medications be mercifully administered to me to alleviate suffering, there's a typo here, even though this may hasten my death. Now, that sounds, pretty straightforward. It's like, well, if there's no reasonable expectation of my recovery from physical or mental disability, so she's covered both bases there, I want to be allowed to die and not be kept alive by artificial means or heroic measures. But here's the problem. What exactly does this require of somebody who is trying to figure out what they should do for this woman? There's a lot of ambiguous language in this, and I'll just highlight some of it. So, for instance, she says that there is no reasonable expectation of my recovery. Well, exactly what constitutes a reasonable expectation? I would assume if the doctor says she has a 100% chance of surviving, well, that's reasonable. If the doctor says she has a 0% chance, well, that's unreasonable. But where do you draw the line? Is it 80%? Is that reasonable? Yeah, seems like it. How about 70, 60, 50, 40? At a certain point, it's very unclear exactly what constitutes a reasonable chance. For instance, if doctors came to me and said, well, your mother is sick, there's a 40% chance that she'll recover from her condition. I don't know. Is that reasonable? I mean, technically the odds are against her, but I don't know, that's a fighting chance in my opinion. Even if they came to me and they said, your mother has a 25% chance of living, I would think, well, we have a fighting chance at this point. And I guess, again, this goes back to what I was saying a second ago about reflecting covert family preferences, because for me, I'm the type of person who I would try to do anything I can to make sure my mother survive. So if the doctor said there's a 1% chance, I'd say, we're going to take it. Other people might say, well, that's just not enough. What is reasonable expectation here? Secondly, what is recovery from physical or mental disability? Does she need to be able to, play the piano just like she did before? Does she need to be able to, run 10 miles like she was doing before? What if the physical recovery is going to be, okay, you'll be, have all your mental capabilities, but you'll be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of your life? Or what if the physical complications are that you'll have to have a leg amputated? What exactly constitutes physical recovery? And furthermore, how about mental disability? What if the person, prior to their accident had, let's say, 140 IQ, which that's genius level, but they're like, all right, after this, they're going to be very forgetful of things. They'll be competent to a certain degree. They'll be aware of things. They'll be able to enjoy life, but they're not going to be what they were. Is that recovery? So again, I mean, to take some interpretation here as to what constitutes mental recovery. So what if the doctor said, oh, you got a 40% chance that she'll be at 80% of her mental capabilities as to what she was? Well, that's a tough thing to decide right there. Is that reasonable expectation of recovery? All of this is very unclear. And so the problem here is this living will was laid down to be guidelines so that people could more accurately determine what to be done for this person. But the truth is, it leaves a whole lot to be desired. Furthermore, she says she doesn't want to be kept alive by artificial means or heroic measures. Okay, so heroic measures, that's terminology. It typically means if the doctors have to perform a really risky kind of procedure or something that goes well beyond what is standard. But even with this, when you talk about heroic measures, I mean, that's something that comes as a matter of degrees. If the doctors, for instance, have to fly you to Switzerland overnight and they have to contact a team of doctors or assemble a team of doctors from all over the world to perform a procedure that's never been done before, okay, that's heroic measures. But what if the doctor has to try a procedure that maybe he or she has read about, they think it has a reasonable shot of working, but they're not sure, but it's something they've never done? Does that constitute heroic measures at that point? And then also, what about artificial means? Again, that covers a wide array of different things here. Does having a feeding tube inserted? Does being intubated? What about if you have to be kept alive by the use of various medications or drugs, and those will have to be administered to you for the remaining your remaining life? And again, all of this is going to be something that's really, really difficult to determine based on what is said here. And it's going to be even much more difficult to interpret these kinds of things when we're dealing with statements that people have made. For instance, my mother told me once, I remember when my grandfather got really sick and was passing away, she said to me, if I ever get like this, just let me die. Well, what exactly is she referring to? If I get like this, that's really a complicated thing to decide, because are you referring to his specific condition? Do you mean like this, or what do you mean like this? And furthermore, excuse me, are those statements actually binding? Or are they not just made in haste? Are they not made when she's being really emotional, seeing her father pass away? Should I hold her feet to the fire because of some statements she made 20 years ago when she was really, really upset about seeing her father deteriorate in such a condition? So there are serious problems with interpreting any kind of even written statements, but also oral statements or various attitudes that people have expressed over the course of their lives. So that's one major problem with interpreting the evidence we have for precedent autonomy and autonomy-based standards. There's a second problem that arises, though, which is equally important, which is the problem of prediction. And as it turns out, people are often really bad at forecasting what they might be able to live with and what they might be able to endure. And I want you to just ask yourself a question. Do you think you would be happier if you won the lottery or if you were paralyzed from the waist down? Well, I think everybody I've ever asked this question of, they said, well, definitely, if I won the lottery, my life would be tremendously better. And if I were paralyzed from the waist down, my life, the quality of life, maybe wouldn't even be worth living at that point. Or my life would just be way worse off. There's actually a study done probably 20, 30 years ago about this very thing. And a team of sociologists, what they did is they tracked people who had won the lottery, and they tracked people who had become paralyzed. And what they discovered is that when people win the lottery, what happens is their happiness spikes right off the bat. Which you could understand that. You mean you come into a lot of money, your happiness is going to spike. Whereas people who had been able to walk but then became paralyzed through like an accident or a condition, their happiness plummeted. Which again, that's very, very reasonable. But what they found is that over time, people who won the lottery, their happiness, even though it initially spiked, went right back to where it was prior to their having won the lottery. And over time, people who became paralyzed, even though their happiness initially plummeted, went right back to where it was prior to their paralysis. And so I mean, this tells us a couple of interesting things about human behavior. But one thing that leaps out for me is that these kinds of things, seem like they would bring either happiness in the case of the lottery or extreme sorrow and misery in the case of paralysis. But people are a lot of times just really bad at predicting the things that would bring them happiness or the things that would bring them pain and suffering. And furthermore, people can live with a great deal more than they, and a lot of times, initially expected. No doubt that some people who became paralyzed, they lived in a pretty miserable state the rest of their life, and no doubt a handful of the people who won the lottery were really happy the rest of their life. But on the whole, on the average, that wasn't the case. On the whole, in general, people learn to cope and deal with their condition. Some conditions are going to be so bad that you can't do it. If you're suffering from, say, bone cancer and you're just in agonizing pain day in, day out, that's something that any reasonable person can predict would be terrible. But, there are lots of things that people can endure and live with. A loss of, for instance, mental capabilities due to various conditions. It seems like it might be horrible if you were, confined to a wheelchair and you weren't, I don't know, the person that you once were. But people find a way to cope in a lot of cases. And I want to share with you guys a video here about this very thing. So just watch along with me. I'll bring this up.
Euthanasia Declaration. After careful consideration of my own free will and in full possession of my mental faculties, I hereby declare.
Wat staat er in de euthanasieverklaring van uw man?
Dat op het moment dat je kunstmatig in leven gehouden moet worden, dat niet mag. Dus niet reanimeren en geen apparaten. En dat als je geestelijk zo ver achteruit gaat dat het leven niet meer levenswaard is, dat je dan ook euthanasie wil.
En vindt u dat dat moment is aangekomen?
Dat vind ik een heel moeilijk punt. Ze willen. Voor deze afdeling is hij op dit moment eigenlijk te oud. Dus ik wilde pas het zorgrapport zien van hem. En toen zei zijn verzorgende van, ja, Bram is eigenlijk te oud voor deze afdeling. Want die is zo jong dementerende, die ook nog allerlei activiteiten doen. Maar als wij hem gaan verplaatsen naar boven of naar beneden, dan hebben we uit ervaring gezien dat mensen heel snel hard achteruit gaan. En ik zei toen tegen haar van, maar dat zou ik helemaal niet erg vinden.
Meneer de Gooijer, daar zit een ontsteking in die heup. Die behandelen we niet meer. We gaan er wel voor zorgen dat hij er geen last van heeft. En als we hem niet behandelen, kan het zijn dat die ontsteking verder gaat. En dat hij daaraan overlijdt. Wat vindt u daarvan als ik dat zeg?
Vindt u dat goed of zegt u nee, ik vind het niet goed? Geef dan een antwoord.
Ja,
Dat vind je niet goed? Nee?
niet goed. Denkt u er altijd zo over of is het wel eens een dag wel of niet? Weet u niet. En dus ik moet als zijn behandelaar bekijken van hoe dat verschil eruit ziet. Is het reëel voor hem of is het niet reëel voor hem? Het gaat om hem, het is zijn leven en dood. Hè?
Ja.
Dat realiseert u zich.
Ja. En ik ben zijn wettige vertegenwoordiger en hij heeft mij in feite door de euthanasieverklaring die we ook op diverse plaatsen ondergebracht hebben, heeft hij mij het recht gegeven om voor hem te beslissen.
Ja, maar dat is ook afhankelijk van datgene wat hij nog zelf kan beslissen of niet. Ik heb daar als zijn arts mee te maken. Ik zou me daar niet goed bij voelen als ik weet dat hij niet wil en ik zou een bepaalde weg gaan bewandelen die zijn dood zou veroorzaken. Want dan zit ik precies tegenovergestelde te doen wat hij wil.
Ik wil dat het voor mijn man tot een eind komt. Voor hem.
Voor hem.
Jazeker. U denkt misschien dat ik hier als een koude kikker zit, maar
Nee,
alles in mij trilt.
Nee, dat begrijp ik.
Ik wil deze lijdensweg niet langer voor hem. Deze.
Wat wil u zeggen? Oké, voor mij mag u het doen. Want dan weten we meteen waar we aan toe zijn. Hartstikke goed. Dus die is gewoon van de baan. Ja.
Now, hopefully you can see from that video exactly what I was talking about. The end of it, it asked, is he really aware of his decision? I think it's pretty clear that he was, but what struck me, there were actually a lot of interesting things that you could ask about it. One, you could actually see the question I was referring to earlier, his wife's decision, what she was deciding about how to, whether or not to refuse treatment for him. Did that reflect any kind of covert preference she might have? She didn't want to see him suffer anymore, and so in her mind, he had reached the point where what he had said in his euthanasia declaration, for us, that's what they were calling it, but it was really his living will. It seemed like in her mind, he had reached that point, and so what she wanted to do was just to allow him, to make him comfortable and allow him to die. And you might wonder, it's like, was she really trying to honor his wishes, or was she trying to avoid pain and suffering for herself and seeing her husband deteriorate? Did she have any other ulterior motives? But beyond that, and this comes right to the point I'm making here with the problem of prediction, based on what he had said in the past, it did seem like he had reached that point. However, once he got to that point, he realized it wasn't quite as bad as he had thought it would be. In fact, that's why he ripped up his euthanasia declaration, or his living will, because he didn't want to be any ambiguity any longer about the fact that he was okay with his present condition. You could see in his present condition he wasn't able to really communicate very effectively. He had very extremely limited mobility, and yet he still was able to have a certain kind of happiness in life. Despite that, he was able to find some reason to continue living. When he was sound and healthy and competent before, he thought, I could never live a life like that. But he found that wasn't true at all. And this is also a problem with autonomy-based standards, is when people write up their living wills, a lot of times they'll think, while they're young and healthy, I could never live this way. When I was 21 years old, I thought, when I get to be 50, that'll be so old. I mean, I got a long ways to go, but now I think about it, I'm like, 50, you're still pretty young. You still got a lot of life left ahead of you. When you're young, things seem one way. When you're healthy, likewise, when you're healthy and you're in, perfect health, things seem one way. But when you get in that condition, they might be very, very different. There's another problem also that comes up and is worth mentioning when we talk about autonomy-based standards, and that is that oftentimes there's a conflict between one's advanced directive and one's current quality of life. And what you'll find is that when sometimes people leave these living wills, or they make oral directives or what have you, they'll want one thing. But if you look at the person now, let's say a person has gone through like mental deterioration as a function of their age. You look at them now, they might be really, really happy. There are many cases of someone who's pleasantly demented, who finds happiness in life and can live even though they're not competent any longer. Maybe someone who suffers from dementia and Alzheimer's. They've basically, as a function of the disease, have deteriorated to, I don't know, kind of the intelligence of a child, you might say, or have the mental life of a child. But nonetheless, they're happy and they're enjoying life and they're receiving a certain quality of life, a good quality of life for them at this point. So sometimes what you'll have is you'll see the advanced directive might say, well, if I get to this state, and a condition comes up, maybe I get an infection in a hip, or maybe I get, I don't know, something happens, allow me to die. But then you look at the person now, and you're like, well, look, they have this, infection that, has come up. We could allow them to die and honor the advanced directive, or we could easily treat this, and the person now could actually experience some happiness and joy in life. And there's a conflict here going on. It's like, why should we, allow the person to die now, even though their condition is easily treatable? Why should we allow them to die when we could treat it and they could enjoy, another 5, 10 years? The person who once, was, well, they're not going to suffer because they're no longer here. The person who is here now, they would enjoy some kind of quality of life. So there is also this concern as well that comes up about the conflict between advanced directives and current quality of life. And it's these types of problems, ambiguity, the problem of prediction, and conflict between advanced directive and current quality of life, which has led some philosophers to argue that we should just reject the autonomy-based standard entirely and adopt a present best interest test. And the idea here is that basically this would avoid all the problems that we see with the autonomy-based standards. And it would allow us to confront quality of life issues up front. Instead of worrying about, is this what Sarah wanted? And well, how exactly do we interpret their living will? How do we interpret their actions throughout their life? We can just ask, what's good for them now? What is good for them now? And this would, the idea here is it would avoid all these problems. Instead of, worrying about, well, they said they wouldn't want this, but actually they seem to be enjoying life now, we can just avoid that kind of conflict altogether. We can avoid the fact that they might have been really, really bad predictors of what they could stand to live with. So this is one proposal here that's offered by Drescher and Robertson. It's just, look, the problems that confront the autonomy-based standard are just too pressing. They're too difficult. So let's just get rid of it. So that's one idea. Of course, I don't know if this is going to do too great a job of alleviating all problems, because this is just going to, it's like those old cartoons where people would sweep trash under a carpet and they push it down in one area and then it would pop up in a different area. I don't know if you guys watched Tom and Jerry growing up, but you'd see that in a lot of old cartoons. It's kind of the same thing here, because yes, they're right that it would avoid these kinds of problems we've seen, but would actually raise another kind of problem, which is, what constitutes a good quality of life for a person now? How exactly is that to be decided? Is that also not going to be equally based on covert family preferences? Is that also not going to be left to the discretion of doctors and other people making that decision about what is good for a person now? And will that also not reflect people who are competent, what they deem to be a good life? If I look at someone who's living in a hospital and who's not competent, and or I should say living in a home and not competent, and in my mind, I wouldn't want to live that way, so I would assume no rational person would want to live that way. So my idea of a good life is going to reflect my own preferences and biases, but that might not be exactly what they would want. So there's a problem here, is that Drescher and Robertson, they suggest, well, let's get rid of the autonomy-based standard because then we can avoid its problems, which seems right, but then you just introduce a whole different set of problems. So I'm not certain that their suggestion is really going to do what they expect it to do. In addition to this, Nancy Roden, she offers a rejoinder, which she adds another type of criticism. And the criticism I'm raising for the Drescher-Robertson proposal is just that while it does avoid certain problems, it introduces its own ambiguities and problems. But Nancy Roden, in addition to this, she points out that if you were to just completely get rid of the autonomy-based standard altogether, then you would run the risk of threatening certain kinds of minority beliefs. And what she means by this is that there's certain types of beliefs that people hold that accord with their own sense of dignity and value that might get threatened if all we were concerned about was current quality of life. And in particular, she points out that Jehovah's Witnesses, as part of their religious beliefs, refuse to accept blood transfusions. So let's just, for the sake of argument, suppose that we didn't respect a patient's precedent autonomy. And let's say that someone was a Jehovah's Witness their whole life. They had held to that faith very, very faithfully, and then they underwent some kind of condition where they lost their mental awareness and their mental competence. But what would keep them alive is a blood transfusion. Well, if all we were concerned about is current quality of life, then what should be done is to give them a blood transfusion. But notice that would violate their religious, and it's not just, I don't want to just focus on religious, but their sense of what is good for their own notion of personal dignity. It would violate their beliefs. And that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like we should be able to violate people's beliefs because of what the average person would want. Because not everybody wants what the average person would want. So this is another kind of worry. And it's not just, again, the religious beliefs. Like, some people, I think the majority of people would probably be okay with certain procedures, but some people maybe being hooked to a respirator, for instance, or maybe being hooked to a feeding tube. I think you find that the majority of people are okay or are willing to do those kinds of things, or maybe undergo dialysis or something like that. But there are always those people who are just very independent, who for personal reasons just do not want any of that. And so if we were to just say, all right, well, let's disregard what they were like, let's disregard their wishes, and now let's just give them what the average person would want, then we would run the risk of just completely ignoring their sense of what is important and their sense of personal values. And that seems wrong. And Nancy Roden talks about the different ways that we can view people. And this is a little abstract, but basically she says, look, if you're going to just completely ignore a person's past, then you're basically, what you have to assume is that once a person undergoes mental deterioration, that you are dealing with two different people. And sometimes we'll use this language is we'll talk about, Sarah's a completely different person now, or Becky's a completely different person now. That's kind of metaphorical, though, when we talk about it. You'll hear people use this language when we talk about people who undergo like mental deterioration at the end of their life. They say, well, it's not really grandmother anymore, right? It's not really, she's not the same person. And when you talk this way, typically I think people talk metaphorically, but if we give it like real, if we really are sincere about this and take it literally, we could interpret them as saying, well, once you undergo a mental deterioration, then literally you are a different person. But Nancy Roden says that doesn't seem accurate. It seems like you're still the same person. You're just at a different stage in your life. Just like, when you were a little child, even though you may not remember being born, that was still numerically you. And so she says we should view life as this, unified narrative that stretches over, an entire, an entire, how would you say this, existence of an individual. And just because you undergo mental deterioration, doesn't mean that it's not literally you anymore. It's still you. It's just you're at a different stage in your life, so to speak. And because it's still you, we have to respect and honor your past decisions that you've made. Even though you have changed, it's still you. In order to justify ignoring your past decisions, what she says is that would require basically viewing you as two different people, which that doesn't seem accurate. You're not literally two people just because you undergo mental deterioration. It's still you. It's just, like I said previously, you're at a different stage in your life. And what Broden points out is she says your advance directive is not simply evidence of what you would want. She says it's an actual choice that you've made. And what she says is that, like all choices, there are going to be some inherent risks involved. So if I say to you, let me, don't keep me on any artificial assistance whatsoever, well, that's a choice I've made. I've said to you, don't do this. And there is risk of it being misinterpreted. There's risk, though, in everything we do. There's risk when you walk across the street. There's risk when you get behind the wheel of an automobile. There's risk in getting married. There are risks in everything. And so what she says is, like all free choices, you assume the risk. And so it's on you to make sure that when you write out your living will or you make those offhand statements about what you would want, that you be very careful about doing so. Because in saying those things and making those decisions, you are basically accepting the risk that is involved. So this is a way of defending basically any kind of precedent autonomy. What Nancy Roden says is that, yes, there are complications with it. Yes, there are problems of prediction. Yes, there are going to be conflicts. Yes, there are going to be ambiguity involved, but you need to be aware of that, and you need to be knowledgeable of the fact that there's a risk in the decisions you make. So be very, very careful when you leave an advance directive to minimize the risk that you take to yourself. Try to be as careful, as precise in your language. Otherwise, if you aren't, you open yourself up to a tremendous amount of risk.